Thank you all for joining us tonight for our second lecture in the History Lecture Series. My plan is to keep this relatively short so that we'll have maximal time to learn from my dear colleague, Charity Urbanski, who is a tremendously accomplished historian of medieval Europe. She's trained at Berkeley and focusing on the political and cultural history primarily of France and England in the 12th century. But as you'll see tonight in her lecture, her expertise is quite comprehensive. She's the author of 2 books, most recently of Medieval Monstrosity in 2023 and Writing History for the King in 2013. She is a gifted educator, and if you listen to our undergraduates in the department, she is constantly lauded as far and away the most exciting professor in the department. I'm excited to trade places and to learn from her tonight about, hostages and prisoners in medieval Europe. Please join me in welcoming Professor Urbanski.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight and helping us continue the tradition of the History Lecture Series. I feel like I'm getting a little feedback up here. Is everything okay with the volume out there? Okay. Louder? All right. Yeah, we were going to try to do both, but can you hear me okay if I just do wireless? Yeah, that's good. All right, great. So I am delighted to be here with you tonight. I'm going to be talking about incarceration in medieval Europe. And the very phrase medieval incarceration has probably already caused a very specific image to form in your mind. And that image probably looks an awful lot like that one. So most of us, I would think, imagine a dungeon or perhaps an oubliette, but certainly some damp, dark place where a prisoner is deposited and, well, forgotten. So for those of you who have visited the Tower of London or almost any other medieval castle, you might also imagine an array of torture devices. And that is because it seems like most castle museums these days are catering to tourists with a taste for the macabre and actively trying to make the medieval period appear as barbaric as possible. So what I'm going to be doing for the next 45 minutes or so is arguing that imprisonment was uncommon in Europe for most of the Middle Ages, and that most of the people who experienced it never saw the inside of a dungeon or a torture device. This is partly because the first stone-built castles, like the Tower of London, weren't actually constructed until the end of the 11th century, which was about 600 years into the medieval period. But also because imprisonment simply wasn't a common judicial punishment in Europe for most of the 1,000 years that we call the Middle Ages. So just so you have a little frame of reference here, we're going to be starting off in the early Middle Ages, but spending a lot of other time in the High Middle Ages tonight. So during the first half of the Middle Ages, from roughly 500 to 1000 of the Common Era, imprisonment was really reserved for the nobility and the royal family, and it really only started to be used in very limited ways for the general population during the 12th century. Likewise, torture was not employed in most Western European legal systems until the 13th century, and even then, there were places like England where it wasn't allowed in regular legal proceedings. On the rare occasion when torture was used in medieval England, it was restricted to people who were believed to pose a threat to the security of the kingdom, and it had to be directly authorized by the monarch. So it was exceptional, it was pretty rare. So I'm going to be focusing on England in the High Middle Ages, largely because medieval England is my area of expertise, but I'm also focusing on it because I simply can't do justice to the wide variety of regional variations in carceral practices that took place in Western Europe over the entire 1,000-year span of the Middle Ages, not unless you want to stay here for a couple of weeks with me. So England also happens to be a particularly relevant case study because the English common law system that forms the basis of our own legal system took shape in the 12th century, and changes that took place during this period led to the creation of the first purpose-built places of incarceration in Europe, or in England, excuse me. So tonight, I'm going to be sketching out a brief history of the uses of incarceration in medieval Europe and explaining why it was so uncommon for much of the period. I'll then be using the examples of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Richard Lionheart, who most of you have probably heard of, to explore how the powerful most often experienced incarceration. And finally, I'll examine how the recovery of Roman law and the idea of the state began to transform carceral practices during the 12th century and led to the construction of the first purpose-built jails in England. So we're going to begin with a very brief history of incarceration in medieval Europe. And I want to begin just by saying that there was nothing in medieval Europe that was comparable to modern imprisonment or even to the Roman imprisonment that we talked about last week. So carceral practices changed dramatically over this 1,000-year period, but people were rarely imprisoned as a form of punishment until the 13th century, and never as a means of rehabilitation. So rather than being punitive, imprisonment was most often custodial or coercive, meaning that it was used to ensure that a person appeared for trial, or it was used to compel a person to do something like pay a ransom or pay a debt. Because incarceration was most frequently used for custodial and coercive purposes, people were generally not imprisoned for very long. Now, there were exceptions to these rules, of course, but imprisonment tended to be infrequent and of short duration. As for how a person experienced imprisonment, that was largely determined by their wealth and their status. For much of the Middle Ages, imprisonment was reserved for the nobility and the royal family, and the conditions they were held in normally reflected the high status of the prisoner. But once commoners began being imprisoned more frequently in the 12th century, the conditions of incarceration began to vary dramatically, and it really depended on the prisoner's ability to pay for things like food and bedding and a private room. So to understand why incarceration was so rare for so long in medieval Europe, I have to start with just a bit of background. So between 400 and 500 of the Common Era, you have Germanic tribes moving into the western half of the Roman Empire. And after the last Western Roman emperor is deposed in 476, these newcomers establish themselves as the new ruling class, and they create this shifting collection of Germanic kingdoms in Western Europe. So the Germanic peoples who now ruled Western Europe brought their own traditions with them, and these slowly replaced Roman practices. One of the most important changes that occurred was that the Germanic kings really regarded their kingdoms as their own personal property, rather than as an entity existing in its own right. So the Roman idea of the state slowly disappears in Western Europe. And the same process happened with the tradition of Roman law, which was slowly replaced by Germanic law. So the loss of the Roman concept of the state and Roman legal traditions turned out to have some important repercussions when it came to ideas about government and law in these new Germanic kingdoms. So government functions were very basic in early medieval Europe. The king had two primary duties, and those were to protect his people through warfare and administer justice. And the Germanic kings did this last thing mainly by issuing law codes like the Lex Salica here. And Germanic law was quite different from Roman law. Germanic law was organized around the concept of the feud. So in Germanic law, any crime a person committed was considered a crime against another individual and their kin group. And this meant that the crime created an obligation on the part of the victim and the victim's kin to exact retribution by visiting a similar injury on the perpetrator. So kin groups were the primary means of enforcing law and order in Germanic society. They were the ones responsible for attempting to regulate the behavior of their members and they collectively faced retribution if they failed to do so. And as you can imagine, this system often led to lengthy cycles of violence between families because each new injury created a fresh obligation to exact revenge. So the disorder that this violence created eventually leads the early Germanic kings to introduce the concept of weregild, or man price, as a means of monetarily compensating victims or their families and preventing long cycles of feuding. So early Germanic law codes, like the Lex Salica up here, are essentially weregild schedules, meaning that they contain a schedule of the fines that free men were expected to pay to their victims for committing various infractions, like injuring, killing, raping, insulting another free person, or damaging their property. And the principle behind weregild was really simple. The more serious the crime and the greater the status of the victim, the larger the fine. So free men who were accused of crimes were tried at regular assemblies. These assemblies were usually presided over by the king, and the person's kin group was responsible for ensuring that the accused appeared before the assembly, and the kin group had to answer for the accused person's crimes if they failed to appear. If a slave committed a crime, on the other hand, the penalty was usually corporal punishment, mutilation, or death, and that punishment was summarily carried out by the slave's owner. So law codes like the Lex Salica set out what a person could expect to pay for committing various crimes, but there was a catch, and that was that the victim or their kin could refuse to accept the weregild. They could refuse to accept compensation and choose to pursue the feud instead. For the most serious, often repeat offenders, Germanic law offered the options of exile and outlawry. And both of these functioned as alternatives to imprisonment. So freemen could either be exiled by the community or by the king on the understanding that they would be executed if they ever returned to the kingdom, or they could simply be put outside the protection of the law. They could be outlawed, meaning that they could be killed by anyone with impunity. For some types of theft, and in cases where a person couldn't afford to pay the required weregild for the crime they had committed, the law required the perpetrator to be enslaved to their victim. So early medieval law was sparse, justice was generally swift, and exile, outlawry, and enslavement all functioned as alternatives to imprisonment. So while most crimes committed by freemen were dealt with through fines or retaliation, there were some crimes that could result in a type of punitive imprisonment. So for example, plotting against the king, leading a rebellion, or merely being an inconvenient member of the royal family could land you in a prison of sorts. But this was assuming that you were too important and too powerful a person to simply execute, exile, or outlaw. So since there were no physical spaces dedicated to incarceration in early medieval Europe, and even most royal palaces at the time were very modest timber buildings, imprisonment most often took the form of being dispatched to a monastery. So members of the royal family or important nobles who plotted against the king were involuntarily sent to monasteries and forced to take up a religious life. Yeah, that's the medieval version of prison, or at least the early medieval version of prison. So once there, they basically had to live out the rest of their days within the confines of the monastic cloister, and this area, this little square angle or area in the center of the monastery is the cloister, and monks were not supposed to leave the confines of the monastery. So they were theoretically cut off from the rest of the world, and they were unable to interfere in politics. So this type of imprisonment was preferable to exile for one simple reason. It kept the troublemaker confined, and it helped ensure they couldn't just go abroad, rally support, and return with an army to challenge the king. However, it was only used for people who were too powerful for the king to simply execute or exile without facing serious repercussions like rebellion. Monasteries also were used as places to deposit wives who were no longer wanted, either because they were past their childbearing years or because they no longer served a political purpose. So during the early Middle Ages, when the church's rules surrounding marriage were looser, kings and noblemen frequently repudiated inconvenient wives and sent them to monasteries that functioned as prisons by keeping them separated from the rest of society. And the rationale for involuntarily sending royal and noble women to monasteries was that it allowed the man to remarry while preventing his wife from doing so. And it was preferable to simply executing an unwanted wife because it helped ensure that her family did not attempt to retaliate against the husband. So monasteries were primarily places devoted to God, of course, but they very frequently served as political prisons in the early Middle Ages as well. So although living in a monastery theoretically deprived a person of contact with the outside world, I do want to emphasize that monks and nuns were not entirely cut off from the rest of society, and the conditions they lived in were far from deplorable. Monasteries like the one I'm showing you here at Whitby were enormously wealthy institutions, and the monks and nuns who lived in them were usually nobles or members of the royal family. They were people who were rich enough to either found their own monastery, like King Oswy of Northumbria and his family, or they were wealthy enough to make the large donation that was required to enter one of these institutions. So this meant that although monks and nuns individually renounced worldly goods in favor of poverty, they owned a great deal collectively, and they lived in relative comfort attended by servants. So sending a rebellious noble, a member of the royal family, or an inconvenient wife to one of these institutions was a means of removing them from the political playing field, but it was one that really respected their place in the social hierarchy. There was another situation in early medieval Europe that called for a type of coercive imprisonment, and that was hostage taking. And unfortunately, I couldn't find a good slide for this. But hostage taking was the practice of taking a person's family members to ensure that person's good behavior. It was common throughout the Middle Ages. So for example, if the king was having trouble with one of his nobles and doubted his fidelity, he could take members of that noble's family, usually his sons, but sometimes his wife or his daughters, to ensure that that noble remained loyal. And if the noble later acted against the king or otherwise broke their agreement, the family members who were serving as hostages could be executed. So the arrangement was simple in concept, if not always effective in practice. So when King Stephen of England took the 5-year-old William Marshall as hostage in 1152, he did so in order to try to secure a truce with William's father, John. However, the practice failed spectacularly on this occasion. John broke his word to the king almost immediately. He refused to surrender Newbury Castle to Stephen, and he practically dared Stephen to kill William over his actions. So Stephen repeatedly threatened to execute William, either by hanging him in front of the castle where his father could see him, or by catapulting him into the castle walls. But he had actually grown quite attached to William by this time, and he couldn't quite bring himself to do it. So poor William ends up being spared in the end, but hostages always ran the risk of being executed for a family member's actions. But really importantly, hostages like William were not being punished, they weren't being mistreated while they were being held. In fact, quite the opposite was true. They were held in what was called honorable captivity, which meant that they were treated like guests or members of the royal household, with the only difference being that they were not free to leave. In fact, the whole purpose of taking hostages required the king to treat those hostages well. He had to house, clothe, feed, and even entertain them in a manner that was suited to their rank and status. Mistreating a hostage, on the other hand, would not only invite misbehavior on the part of the noble who has pledged his family members as hostages, it could cause the rest of the nobles to mistrust the king or even incite a rebellion against him. In the case of King Stephen, he seems to have entertained young William Marshall in his own tent and even appears to have played soldiers with the child. And this type of treatment was really common for hostages. So whether prisoners were involuntarily sent to a monastery or kept in a royal household, imprisonment was rare during the early Middle Ages. It was generally reserved for the highest ranking members of society. For those who were sent to monasteries, it was punitive. It served as an alternative to harsher punishments like exile and execution. Hostage taking, on the other hand, was coercive, and it served as a means of enforcing loyalty to the king. In either case, the conditions in which these prisoners were held reflected their high social status. So most of the people who were considered prisoners before the 12th century, really before the end of the 12th century, would have experienced honorable captivity in a royal household or something like a comfortable retirement in a wealthy monastery. For most of these prisoners, the only difference between freedom and incarceration was the ability to leave at their own volition. So two of the most famous prisoners to experience this form of incarceration were Eleanor of Aquitaine and her son, Richard Lionheart. Eleanor and Richard were both political prisoners, very much like the ones that had been dispatched to monasteries in the early Middle Ages. However, there were some important differences. In Eleanor's case, she was the Queen of England, and her crime was inciting her sons, including Richard, to rebel against their father, King Henry II here, which she did. They rebelled in 1173. So in an earlier period, Henry most likely would have repudiated Eleanor and sent her off to a monastery, where she would have enjoyed a comfortable retirement surrounded by other members of the nobility and the royal family. But by this time, repudiating an inconvenient wife was a much more difficult proposition, largely because the church had spent most of the 12th century insisting that marriage was indissoluble and that only people with a sincere desire to live a religious life should be admitted to monasteries. Still, Henry II could have wrangled an annulment from a pope if he had really wanted to get rid of Eleanor. The thing that stopped Henry from doing that was the vast duchy of Aquitaine down there in southwestern France. This was the land that Eleanor had inherited and that Henry controlled in his wife's name. So if Henry had his marriage to Eleanor annulled, he would lose the duchy of Aquitaine as well. And faced with this reality, Henry decided to preserve his marriage but imprison his wife. If anybody wants me to ask, or anyone wants to ask me about this image later, I'll be happy to explain it more. I couldn't find an image of Eleanor being in prison, so I had to go with another queen. At any rate, so Henry held Eleanor in various castles from 1173 until his own death in 1189, but Eleanor was never sent to a dungeon. Even though the kings of England had covered the country with hundreds of stone-built castles during the 12th century, castle dungeons were primarily used for holding common criminals who were awaiting trial or execution, and for soldiers who had deserted their posts. All of these were short-term arrangements for people of far lower social station. So Eleanor was a political prisoner on the old model. She spent most of her 15 years as a captive in the castle of Old Sarum in Wiltshire, which only the foundations remain today. But she lived there in comfort, in royal apartments, attended by her household staff. So the most meaningful differences between Eleanor's life as queen before her imprisonment and her life as a prisoner were that she was not free to leave her place of confinement, and she was no longer directly involved in politics. In fact, Henry kept Eleanor heavily guarded at first, mainly because he quite rightly feared her influence over their sons, and he kept her in England, where it was more difficult for her to appeal for help, either to her own people in Aquitaine or to her first husband, King Louis VII of France. So as time went on, Henry allowed Eleanor more freedom. He even trotted her out on important occasions. But she was only finally released when Henry died in 1189 and their son Richard took the throne. And so one of Richard's first acts as king was releasing his mother from captivity. Eleanor returned to political activity, and she ended up being a really valuable asset during Richard's reign as King of England. She acted as regent during Richard's absences from England, which were numerous. He was only in England for about 6 months of his entire 10-year reign. She acted as a mediator between Richard and his brother John, who was trying to take over the kingdom while Richard was gone. But most importantly, she raised Richard's ransom and negotiated his release when he was taken prisoner. So Richard was returning from the Third Crusade in 1192 when he was captured by Duke Leopold V of Austria, a man he had insulted at the Siege of Acre the previous year by allowing his men to throw the Duke's banner into a ditch. So the Duke held Richard briefly, then handed him over to Emperor Henry VI, who imprisoned Richard at Trefel's Castle in Germany and threatened to hand Richard over to his rival, King Philip Augustus of France. So like his mother, Richard's experience as a prisoner initially reflected his royal status. Duke Leopold may have captured Richard due to a personal slight, but he had treated Richard with respect as a royal prisoner. And even Emperor Henry VI had initially treated Richard well. But the conditions of Richard's confinement gradually worsened until the king was finally kept in chains. So Richard's imprisonment was unusual in several respects. It was unusual that he was captured at all, because returning crusaders were under the special protection of the papacy. This made Richard's capture a blatantly illegal act, and the Pope, in fact, excommunicated Duke Leopold for it. It was also highly unusual for a prisoner of Richard's status to be kept in anything other than honorable captivity. And in fact, Emperor Henry VI's decision to change Richard was instigated by one of Richard's enemies from the French court. It absolutely shocked contemporaries. So royal and noble prisoners had always expected and most often experienced a degree of consideration for their status. And it was also considered dishonorable for a person to chain or otherwise mistreat a royal or noble prisoner. In fact, when kings were criticized for their treatment of prisoners in 12th and 13th century chronicles, it was always because they had resorted to chaining prisoners or holding them in conditions that did not reflect their social status. So Richard's imprisonment broke all of the social conventions around the taking of prisoners. When Richard was captured, his mother Eleanor sprang into action in her capacity as regent. She was certainly motivated by compassion for her son, but she was likely motivated by her own experiences as a prisoner as well. Eleanor took the lead in raising the enormous sum of 150,000 silver marks that Emperor Henry VI had demanded. At the time, that amounted to 2 years of royal revenue in England. In today's terms, it would be about $3 billion. So it was massive, it was enormous, it was outrageous. Eleanor collected most of this massive ransom by levying a 25% tax on all movable property and income in England. She also personally traveled to Germany to negotiate her son's release, and she finally returned to England with Richard in March of 1194. So just as Eleanor had used her release from captivity to reassert her power and return to political life, Richard did so as well. And in Richard's case, he needed to reassert his authority as king and try to erase the humiliation that had been caused by his captivity. So Richard stages a triumphal second coronation for himself in April of 1194. Then he goes on a fundraising tour of England before leaving for Normandy in May of 1194 to face his nemesis, King Philip Augustus of France. Now, this may seem like an odd choice since Philip had not been directly involved in Richard's capture or his imprisonment, but Philip had used the opportunity that it presented to invade Richard's lands in France. And Philip Augustus had also lobbied the emperor to increase Richard's ransom and prolong his captivity. It also happened to be a member of Philip's court who had convinced the emperor to place Richard in chains. So both Eleanor and Richard lived during a time when profound changes were taking place in Europe. One of the most important changes was that slavery had been eradicated in Western Europe by around the year 1000, although it obviously later returned with a vengeance. The church had been actively preaching against the practice of Christians enslaving other Christians, and most slaves in Western Europe had been converted to a state of semi-freedom known as serfdom. This meant that enslavement was no longer the easy alternative to imprisonment that it had been during the early Middle Ages. However, exile and outlawry still remained viable options. Another really important change was that power in much of Western Europe had devolved from the king to local lords, which resulted in a patchwork of local laws and jurisdictions. This is going to be important to us because it's the efforts of the 12th century English kings to break up these local jurisdictions and centralize justice that actually leads to the development of the English common law. The final important development was the recovery of Roman law, which took place in Bologna, Italy in the 1070s, when scholars discovered an old copy of Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, or, well, a compilation of Roman law that had originally been created in the 6th century under the Emperor Justinian. This had been lost in the West for centuries, and they literally just found it on a monastery bookshelf. So this discovery ends up reintroducing the concept of the state back into Western Europe, as well as the Roman legal principle that some crimes were crimes against the state and not crimes against individuals. So these developments help lead to the incarceration becoming more common in Western Europe. So imprisonment was still not a common judicial punishment for most of the 12th century. It was still largely reserved for nobles whose wealth and status protected them from execution and other forms of corporal punishment, or for hostages who were taken from noble families and used to ensure good behavior. During the 12th century, however, imprisonment came to be associated with the nobility for another reason, and this was the practice of taking prisoners during war and holding them for ransom. So in the early Middle Ages, most prisoners of war had been quickly enslaved, while others had been executed. But by 1100, centuries of clerical moralizing against the practice of killing or enslaving other Christians had begun to have some effect on Europe's nobles, at least when it came to killing or enslaving other nobles who could afford to pay a ransom. It also helped that Europe's noble and royal families had been intermarrying with each other for centuries by this time, so the vast majority of them were related to each other. This made them more willing to take each other prisoner and more likely to treat prisoners well. As with the practice of hostage-taking, noble prisoners were usually held in honorable captivity, which meant that they were treated as guests until the ransoms were paid and they were released. In fact, how well a noble treated his prisoners was often seen as a measure of his own nobility. So treating your prisoners well enhanced your reputation, but mistreating a noble prisoner actually dishonored the person. It shamed the person who engaged in it. Those who did so were not only criticized, they ran the risk of receiving similar treatment if they were ever taken prisoners themselves. So for the most part, the honor code of Western Europe's nobles, coupled with the fact that many captors and their prisoners were related to each other in some way, ensured that most prisoners of war were not mistreated. However, there was an exception to this rule as well, and that applied mainly to men who rebelled against the king. So when rebels were captured, they were generally handed over to the king, and they faced exile, mutilation, imprisonment, or often execution. These punishments were far more common during the late 11th and early 12th centuries, so during the reigns of William the Conqueror and his sons William Rufus and Henry I, than they were with later English kings. William the Conqueror in particular spent his entire reign subduing the kingdom that he had just conquered, and he often had captured rebels blinded or had their hands chopped off in order to prevent them from posing a threat to him in the future. His son William Rufus had one rebel blinded and castrated for his disloyalty, and then had the man's steward hanged for good measure. Imprisonment in a royal castle was also pretty common in such cases, but this was most often temporary. When kings held prisoners for long periods of time, people tended to notice, and they tended to disapprove. For example, the early 12th century chronicler, Orderic Vitalis, wrote that Henry I's prisoners often, quote, died in his fetters and could neither gain release through kinship nor noble birth, nor ransom themselves with money. So Orderic's critical tone here and his expectation that such prisoners should have been able to negotiate their freedom tell us a great deal about how unusual Henry I's treatment of his prisoners was. So kings could deal very harshly with rebels, but in other cases they were willing to show them mercy. In 1097, the same William Rufus arrived at a castle near Wales where there were a large number of fighters who had been involved in an uprising, so they were being held at the castle. And as William approached, the captives shouted out to the king to help them. William not only released them from their cells, he also treated them to a good meal and allowed them to walk freely around the castle. And when some of William's followers objected to this and pointed out to the king that a prisoner might easily escape, William Rufus actually rebuked them for their severity. So the incident really demonstrates the generally acknowledged obligation to treat prisoners well, even if that obligation wasn't always scrupulously observed. And it also serves as a reminder that one of the virtues most frequently associated with medieval kingship was clemency. Regular prisoners of war received better treatment than rebels, but the king still faced the problem of where to keep them. A king could have hundreds of such prisoners in his custody at any one time, and they all had to be held somewhere. So government records reveal that prisoners of war were usually split into small groups and sent to various castles throughout the kingdom. This map shows you a distribution of castles in southern England. You can just kind of ignore most of the ones in Wales because they're later. But so they would be sent to a castle, they would be placed in the custody of a noble, and that noble was expected to care for them and guard them, along with other hostages and captives. However, we also know that these prisoners frequently escaped from the castles that were meant to serve as their prisons. And we know that they sometimes did this with the active assistance of their jailers. So the nobles, believing that someone's imprisonment was unjust, would sort of help them slip out. The fact that so many members of the nobility were allowed to escape from custody points to a consensus that such prisoners should not be confined for long periods of time, and that nobles in particular deserve to be treated in accordance with their status. It's also worth mentioning that kings had an obligation to secure the release of their own men who had been taken prisoner, and they were expected to do this very quickly, either by negotiating prisoner exchanges or by paying the ransoms that were being asked for these prisoners. And so this obligation also helped ensure that most prisoners of war didn't remain in captivity for long. So since most prisoners were hostages who were being held in honorable captivity, rebels against the king who usually received swift punishment, or prisoners of war who could expect a fairly quick release, there was little need for large-scale places of confinement in the early 12th century. But that doesn't mean there were no prisons. The earliest type of medieval prison, again, was the monastic prison cell. By the 12th century, most monasteries, like the one you see here, Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, actually contained a cell that was specifically used to punish miscreant monks or nuns by keeping them in solitary confinement for a short time. So these prisons were most often used to enforce monastic discipline. They were primarily places where monks and nuns performed penance and experienced spiritual growth. And in a sense, the monastic prison cell replicated the confinement that all monks and nuns experienced within the cloister. It was an extension of the monastic idea that confinement was a means of expiating one's sins and achieving union with God. So in the monastic context, confinement was not necessarily viewed as a punishment. It was viewed more as a means of performing penance. These monastic prison cells, and actually here, the three that are sort of noted in the caption on the slide are in the basement of the abbot's house here. So these monastic prison cells could also be used to hold people who were awaiting trial for crimes that now fell under the jurisdiction of the church. So during the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the church established its jurisdiction over religious crimes like heresy, moral infractions like adultery and fornication, as well as over marriage and family law. And it had created a network of ecclesiastical courts that covered Western Europe and that were used to adjudicate these crimes. The punishments that these ecclesiastical courts imposed ranged from penance to whipping to being handed over to the secular authorities for capital punishment, but they did not include imprisonment. Still, the members of the clergy who presided over these courts found that they needed places of confinement to hold people who were awaiting trial. And the first purpose-built jail in England was, in fact, created by a member of the clergy for precisely this reason. This is the Bishop Henry of Winchester. This is the jail he created, which quickly became known as the Clink. So here's the Clink Prison Museum in London on the site of the original prison constructed by the Bishop of Winchester. So when Henry, the Bishop of Winchester, had a new palace and chapel built for himself in London's Southwark neighborhood in 1144, he made sure that this complex included quarters to house both male and female prisoners who were waiting for trial in his court. So, as I mentioned, the bishop's jail quickly becomes known as the Clink. Very importantly, it was not intended to punish or even to reform criminals. It was merely intended to hold them before trial. If anyone happens to be wondering, the first house of correction in England appeared about 400 years later, when one of Henry VIII's former residences, London's Bridewell Palace, was converted to a prison for vagrants in 1556. If we turn to look at 12th century developments in royal justice, this is the period when the English kings are attempting to extend their authority, attempting to break up local jurisdictions, and the primary reason for this turns out to be financial. Judicial punishments in the 11th and 12th centuries still fell into three major categories: fines, mutilation or corporal punishment, and death. The major change from the early Middle Ages was that fines were now payable to the lord who presided over the court that imposed them, rather than to the victim or their family, as they had been under earlier Germanic law. So this meant that every lord in England who held jurisdiction over the people who lived on his land, whether he was a baron or a bishop, got to collect the fines that were imposed by his court. After conquering England in 1066, William the Conqueror had declared that certain serious crimes like treason, murder, rape, arson, robbery, and breaking the king's peace were pleas of the crown that had to be heard in the royal courts. Effectively, this meant it had to be heard in the king's presence. William was building on the laws of his Anglo-Saxon predecessors to centralize some aspects of royal justice, but these pleas of the crown turned out to be a significant source of revenue. And so when William's son, Henry I, finds himself facing a depleted royal treasury, he decides that there's no reason that more of these fines shouldn't be contributing to the royal coffers instead of lining the pockets of his nobles and bishops. So Henry I expands the list of crimes considered pleas of the crown and starts sending itinerant justices on regular circuits across England to hear these cases. And this brings more revenue into the royal coffers, but it also helps to expand the king's authority. It's actually Henry I's grandson, Henry II, who made the most significant changes to England's legal system, and Henry II is now credited with being the father of the common law. Henry II had declared that most criminal cases had to be heard in royal courts. He established new legal procedures and standardized writs to streamline the delivery of justice. He instituted an early version of the grand jury system to identify suspected criminals. He sent royal justices out to hear cases. And he established a permanent court at Westminster, which later became the Court of King's Bench, to hear pleas of the crown during the king's numerous and lengthy absences from the kingdom. Henry was often in France, where most of his lands were. So many of these developments were assisted by the recovery of Roman law. While English common law is based on customary legal tradition, Henry II and his advisors incorporated some Roman legal principles and procedures into their reforms. And they deployed the Roman concept of the state to justify their efforts to centralize authority and create a single, consistent body of law that applied to all free men in the kingdom. The increasing centralization of justice under the English kings had obvious benefits for the crown. It enhanced royal authority, it eroded the power of the nobles, and it provided a major source of royal revenue. But it also created some new problems. The most obvious problem was that royal justice could not be everywhere in England all the time. Even with royal justices riding regular circuits to hear cases and a permanent court now sitting at Westminster, there was often a considerable lag between a criminal's apprehension and their trial. And during that period, they might go missing and fail to appear in court at all. So Henry II ends up addressing this issue through the Assize of Clarendon in 1166, when he requires every sheriff in England to have a jail in which to hold people who are awaiting trial before the king's justices. And in the numerous counties where no such jail existed, the king ordered sheriffs to build one in either the county town or in one of the royal castles at the king's expense. This order ends up revolutionizing carceral practices in England. It expanded imprisonment from something that was largely reserved for the nobility to something that is being routinely imposed on commoners. It required dedicated spaces to hold prisoners, and the conditions in many of these spaces reflected the fact that their primary purpose was to hold common criminals for short periods of time while they were awaiting trial or execution, as you see this unfortunate man awaiting probably execution, given that there's a gallows in the background. So in practice, Henry II's order to create new jails throughout England usually resulted in the conversion of some existing space. But some new buildings were erected specifically for the purpose of holding prisoners. The first jail built in response to Henry's order was Newgate Prison in London, which is represented by the top left yellow arrow. Below it is the Fleet Prison, and then over on the right is the Tower. So these are all on the fringes of medieval London, all outside the gates. So Newgate Prison in London opens in 1188, and by 1216, there are jails in all but 5 English counties. Rather than trying to survey conditions all over the country, I'm going to focus on these 3 jails in London: Newgate, the Fleet, and the Tower. And this is really because London was the center of royal justice. So although we have no surviving records or prison records from medieval London, we do have royal and city records that contain a great deal of information about the construction of these prisons and what the conditions were like inside them. Like many of the new jails, Newgate was built into the city's walls next to a gate, and prisoners enjoyed pretty easy contact with the outside world. Life inside the prison, however, very much depended on a person's wealth. The prisoners in Newgate, like those in other medieval jails, had to pay fees, both when they entered the prison and when they left, and they had to pay for everything they received from their jailers during their incarceration. That included their food, their bedding, charcoal, and candles. The royal jails may have been built at the Crown's expense, but their operation was not funded by the Crown. In fact, the Crown seems to have viewed its prisoners as a potential source of income for the royal wardens who ran these jails and collected these fees. So this system of fees meant that every jail quickly developed a side that catered to wealthier prisoners and a side with more meager accommodation for those who were less fortunate. In the wealthier side, prisoners had private rooms, they had better food, better supplies, they could bring in their own wine, they could purchase food and have that brought to them as well. But prisoners on the poorer side tended to have to share rooms and sometimes beds. The poorest prisoners had to beg for alms from passers-by in order to pay for their food, their heat, and their light. By the early 13th century, another important innovation had occurred. While judicial punishments were still mainly issued in the form of fines, corporal punishment, or execution, people who could not pay the fines the royal court had assessed on them were now being confined in jails like Newgate until their debts were paid. So this type of imprisonment was coercive. It was intended to compel a prisoner's family and their friends to pay the fines that they owed the Crown. But it resulted in a significant expansion of the population that was incarcerated in royal jails. There were now more people experiencing imprisonment for longer periods of time, and they tended to be the poorest members of society, the ones who could least afford to pay the fines. Over time, the number of impoverished prisoners at places like Newgate grew, and it's likely that their conditions worsened. But we don't have any evidence of overcrowding during the medieval period, and this is probably due to the fact that the population of London was pretty low. In 1200, it was probably something like 20,000 people. What we do have a lot of complaints about are complaints about prisoners being charged excessive fees. So when we look at the surviving medieval records, there are lots of complaints about the fees, but not a lot of complaints about the conditions within the prison. Conditions at the Fleet prison in London, which again is located just a short way away from Newgate. So the Fleet prison in London, it's built in 1197. The conditions there are considerably better than those at Newgate. And the reason for this is that the Fleet was initially built as a place for the king to hold people who owed money to him. That was its purpose. So conditions at the Fleet were apparently so much better than those at Newgate that people who were accused of misdemeanors and would have been destined for Newgate often claimed that they owed money to the Crown in order to be committed to the Fleet prison instead. And this is because debts to the Crown took precedence over all other accusations. And the prices that were charged at the Fleet reflected this perception of better conditions. Prisoners at the Fleet had to pay 2 shillings and 4 pence upon entering the prison, which was 2 shillings or 24 pence more than the mere 4 pence that other London prisons were allowed to charge. As at other prisons, those incarcerated at the Fleet had to pay for their food and lodging, but the fact that the prisoners at the Fleet were wealthy, generally wealthy, meant that they lived in relative comfort. Some of them, we know, were even allowed to pay for the privilege of living in nearby accommodations rather than living inside the prison itself. At the other end of the spectrum, the fleet also began housing debtors, poorer debtors in the early 13th century, and their living conditions were, of course, decidedly worse. The poorest inmates slipped to a bed, had to beg for alms from passersby through a grate. And we know from later records that there were clear gradations of accommodation within the fleet. The parlor and the tower lodgings were considered the best. And at the other end of the spectrum, you had the beggar's ward and the hole, which were reserved for the most indigent. Unlike at Newgate, which was built into the city wall, excavations have determined that the Fleet prison the prison was basically built on a small island in the River Fleet. This new structure was a rare stone-built jail consisting of a four-sided tower with a turret in each corner that would have looked very similar to the central keep at the Tower of London. Despite the fact that the prison was surrounded by the Fleet River, it seems clear that the inmates at the Fleet were not cut off from the outside world. Not only could poor inmates communicate with passersby through a grate, but visitors were regularly allowed, just as they were at other prisons. In fact, visiting prisoners was regarded as a Christian duty and one of the 7 acts of mercy that medieval Christians were routinely encouraged to undertake. And these 7 acts of mercy were often represented in pictorial cycles on the walls of medieval churches, as they are at St. Andrew's in Wickhampton. This duty to visit the imprisoned was more widely understood as an obligation to contribute to their material well-being through giving them alms, and we have numerous bequests in medieval wills granting money to feed and pay the release fees of poor prisoners at places like Newgate and the Fleet. And although such alms and bequests were frequent, they were not enough to guarantee that all the poorer prisoners were able to pay for their release. And the practice of prolonging incarceration until a prisoner's fees were paid generated a great deal of resentment, as you can imagine. Both Newgate and Fleet prisons became the focus of popular hostility due to the Crown's practice of imprisoning people who could not pay their fines. In 1352, imprisonment for debt was extended to include people who owed money to private individuals, not just the Crown. And this only made matters worse. The population of debtors at both prisons increased, contributing to worsening conditions for the poorest inmates. This practice of holding poor people in prison for their debts was such a source of grievance among the general population that it ended up becoming a flashpoint for violence during periods of rebellion. During the English Peasants' Rebellion of 1381, rebels attacked both the Newgate and the Fleet prisons as part of their assault on the legal system that oppressed them. In addition to targeting specific members of the government, attacking lawyers, and burning legal documents, the rebels entered both prisons, freed the debtors, and destroyed the Fleet prison so thoroughly that it had to be rebuilt. I want to end this brief survey of medieval London prisons with one of the most notorious places of confinement in England, the Tower of London. So the central keep, or White Tower, was built by William the Conqueror as part of his effort to consolidate his conquest of England. It was built in 1078, and it was actually William and the Normans who had first brought castle building technology to England with them in 1066. And as the Bayeux Tapestry illustrates here, they seem to have had sort of prefabricated castles that they brought over. And so you see William and the Normans constructing a wooden castle on a mound. This is known as a Motte and Bailey Castle, shortly after landing at Hastings, so that they have a place to stay, to protect themselves. So they bring castle building technology to England with them, and they use these castles primarily as a means of subjugating the conquered English. The earliest castles were these simple wood and earthwork constructions known as Motte and Bailey castles. They could be thrown up very quickly and very cheaply, but they were soon followed by more imposing and more permanent stone castles. The Tower of London itself was one of these early stone castles. It served as a royal fortress and residence, but by 1100, its central keep was being used to hold the king's enemies while they awaited trial or execution. The tower's first prisoner was a man named Ranulph Flambard, who happened to be the Bishop of Durham. He was imprisoned in 1100 by the newly crowned King Henry I on charges of embezzlement. But the bishop's real crime was that he had been the architect of some unpopular efforts to raise royal revenues under the previous king, William Rufus. So 6 months into his captivity, Ranulph Flambard also has the distinction of becoming the first prisoner to escape from the Tower of London. His friends smuggled a rope into him and a flagon of wine, and he used that to climb down out of the Tower of London and jump onto a getaway boat that took him to France. So the tower ends up holding an array of famous prisoners during the Middle Ages, including another escapee, well, kind of escapee, the Welsh prince Griffith ap Llewellyn, who died attempting to escape the tower in 1244. So very much like Ranulph Flambard, he attempted to lower himself down for a rope. In this case, it was one he had fashioned from his bed sheets. Unfortunately, Griffith's rope broke and he fell to his death. So the tower also held two kings of Scotland, John Balliol and David II, and King John the Good of France, all three of whom were eventually released. So during the Middle Ages, the tower was generally reserved for the highest status prisoners. They were kept in royal apartments in honorable captivity, and you can see Charles, the Duke of Orleans, looking out the window there. So not in the dungeon, they're kept in royal apartments. And many of them were even allowed to leave the grounds temporarily, especially to go hunting, but occasionally to go shopping. As for the instruments of torture that are so prominently displayed in the tower today, none of them actually date from the Middle Ages. Torture became a prominent feature of many European legal systems in the late Middle Ages, but this only occurred in regions that adopted Roman law, which viewed torture as a legitimate means of eliciting confessions. English common law, on the other hand, prohibited the use of torture except in extraordinary circumstances. So all of the torture devices that are on display at the Tower of London actually date from the 16th and 17th centuries after the Middle Ages had ended. They were only used for a short period during a time of extreme religious and political turmoil in England, and only under direct orders from the crown. The prisoners who were sent to the tower during the Middle Ages, on the other hand, were usually the wealthiest and most privileged people in society. And the conditions that they were held in usually reflected their social status. The experience of incarceration in medieval England varied dramatically depending on a person's wealth and status. For most noble and royal prisoners, it often amounted to a house arrest. But even within royal prisons, a person's wealth and their ability to pay a variety of fees and supply themselves with provisions determined how they experienced incarceration. Prison accommodations were certainly not equitable, but it's important to remember that the inequities found in medieval prisons replicated the inequities of medieval society in general. For most prisoners, the accommodation they received in prison would have at least resembled what they had in their own homes. You have to remember that private bedrooms were rare even among the very wealthy until around 1450, so the very end of the Middle Ages. The vast majority of medieval people would have lived with their entire families in 2 or 3 rooms at most, and sharing a bed was really common. Likewise, the vast majority of medieval people would have had pretty meager furnishings, food, light, and heat by our standards. So the discomfort and inequality that the poor experienced in prison reflected the discomfort and inequality that they experienced in their daily lives. As for the perception that medieval prisoners were simply shackled to a dungeon wall and left to rot, as places like the Medieval Torture Museum in Chicago would have you believe. The evidence we have suggests that this was rarely the case. Dungeons were normally reserved for people who were awaiting execution, which usually came quite quickly. And the evidence we have suggests that no medieval English prison had the means to chain all of its prisoners. The royal records for the Marshalsea prison in London note that in 1352, there were just 9 pairs of fetters and 2 chains in the entire prison. By 1483, the inventory at the Marshalsea had increased, and it had 11 pairs of manacles, 2 single collars with chains, 2 double collars with chains, and numerous shackles. But even this would have been far from sufficient to restrain everyone in the prison. We also see a remarkable lack of complaints about the use of restraints in the royal records. And this really bears out the impression that the use of chains or ironing, as it was often referred to, was not widespread in the Middle Ages. It seems to have only been during the early modern period that the practice of ironing or chaining prisoners became far more common. And it seems to have been most often used as a cheap alternative to actually making the buildings themselves more secure. So as it turns out, much of our popular perception of what medieval incarceration was like is based on later fabrications about the Middle Ages. Like the majority of the so-called medieval instruments of torture that were actually manufactured in the 19th century and scurrilously attributed to the Middle Ages, this view of medieval incarceration was largely created by the Victorians, and it's been perpetuated by the popular tendency to portray anything medieval as barbaric. The reality of incarceration in medieval England was far more complex than we've been led to believe, especially by popular history, modern media, and tourist traps looking to profit from our obsession with the macabre. So since our next lecture is going to focus on incarceration in the US during the 20th century, I want to end simply by emphasizing how different medieval carceral practices were from modern ones. By the end of the Middle Ages, jails were found throughout Europe, and incarceration was becoming more common, both as a punishment for actual crimes and as a punishment for debt, or coercive, a means of coercion. However, no medieval polity had the means or the inclination to imprison large portions of their populations for long periods of time, nor did they subject them to the same types of surveillance and control found in modern or even Roman prisons. We've been led to believe that medieval carceral practices were exceptionally brutal and horrific, and I'm certainly not going to argue that incarceration in a medieval jail was pleasant. But the horrors of long sentences, hard labor, overcrowding, mass incarceration, strict surveillance, and lack of contact with the outside world are all much more recent innovations. And honestly, compared to many aspects of medieval or modern incarceration, some of these medieval carceral practices look almost humane. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Charity. Can you hear me in the back? Yes. Thank you so much, Charity, for introducing us to a wide swath of history and yet a different form of carceral society, still a carceral society, but a fundamentally different one from what came before and from what came after. I want to ask you, I'm going to use my privilege as moderator to ask a question first, and then we have a number of questions coming in the chat.
I'm going to sneak my wallet.
I wanted to ask you first about monastery incarceration.
Sure.
Which is, as you point out, sort of custodial, and in the ancient world, there's nothing like reformatory or rehabilitative incarceration, and in the medieval period, you'd say that also doesn't exist. I wonder if you see this new form of monastery incarceration as sort of the inklings, the beginnings of something like reformatory incarceration, because, well, religion has a way of reforming people, and I wonder how you see that sort of fitting into this picture.
That's a great question, and I was very, very tempted to make at least some sort of nod during that part of the lecture to the fact that there is a penitentiary system that develops in the early modern period that is obviously deriving a lot of ideas about the rehabilitative potential of incarceration from these monastic settings. I'm sure there is somebody who has done some work on that, and it was not me. But yeah, no, I definitely see there are echoes of this idea that confinement can be a means of penance that become a very important theme in the early modern period and do lead to practices that focus more on reforming the prisoner and rather than punishing. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So we have a number of questions coming in, and the first one is a rather practical one. What would stop a person from leaving the monastery that they were confined at?
That's a really great question, and we don't always know. And some people do manage to escape from the monasteries as well, although weirdly it's not as frequent as escaping from a castle. So generally when somebody was placed in a monastery involuntarily, there were other people making sure they stayed there. We definitely know that some people tried to escape, some people in fact did succeed. But yeah, when they were placed there, they probably were under a lot more scrutiny than just the average monk or nun. But because of the way that monastic life was organized in general, monks slept in open dormitories, everything was communal. And so you would immediately notice if somebody had gone missing, right? It would be very, very apparent. And so there does seem to be some indications that there may have been, guards of a sort placed over the person, absolutely.
Great, thank you. Another sort of practical question about another form of incarceration that you mentioned, which is hostages.
Yeah.
So one person asks, when hostages were taken to ensure loyalty, were they ever given back? And wasn't loyalty required for life? So if you needed loyalty for life, don't you just keep this person for life?
They kept them for long periods of time. Hostages were quite frequently given as small children, so William Marshall's 5 years old when he's handed over to King Stephen. In some cases we know that hostages were held for 15, 20 years until the person was, an adult. However, one of the benefits of hostage taking and the fact that these hostages were treated as sort of honored guests was that they developed a relationship with the person who was holding them. The person who was holding them basically functioned as their foster father. And so what the king generally wanted to do was build as strong an emotional bond as he possibly could. So by the time that person was released, chances were pretty good their father was probably going to be dead or on his way out. And now this person, who the king had raised effectively, would be bound by these very strong emotional bonds to the king. So it was, yeah.
That's great. I'm going to jump in one more time and ask you. So you've done such a wonderful job bringing together a wide variety of sources and telling us that sort of this narrative of the changes in carceral practices over a pretty long period of time. And I wanted you to tell us something about the sources that you're using. How do you learn about these things? What are are they narrative sources? Are they documentary sources? What is this analysis built on?
It's a combination. Yeah. So there are a lot of narrative sources. We know from sources like Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks about a lot of royal and noble women being repudiated by their husbands and sent to convents. We know that this was a fairly consistent practice, at least under the Merovingians. We know, for example, the Franks have a long history of sending rebellious nobles and rebellious members of the royal family to monasteries. So it's in a lot of chronicles and a lot of sort of more narrative sources, obviously relying on early Germanic law, things like the Lex Salica and Yeah, so it's a collection. So that's for the early Middle Ages. As we come, and it's a similar mix of sources as we come forward in time. So it's a combination of chronicles that tell us sort of what the king's doing and who's being imprisoned. But we start getting more and more sources. There's still, not a lot of them, but at least we get more about. Especially after Henry's decrees that royal jails need to be built in every county in England. Royal record keeping gets so much better in the 12th century. Something about having permanent government institutions really helps with record keeping. So the record, those types of documentary records become much more common and rich in the 12th century, where we don't have any, or very, very few in the early Middle Ages.
Thank you. We have a question. Why could Eleanor of Aquitaine be divorced from Louis VII, but the marriage to Henry II was indissoluble?
Well, it wasn't. I would argue that the marriage to Henry II wasn't indissoluble. It was harder to repudiate an inconvenient wife in the 12th century, but it was not impossible. Popes were still willing to work with kings and nobles, especially if they lacked an heir, if they had been married for a very long time. In the case of Eleanor's first marriage to Louis VII, they had been married for 15 years and only had 2 daughters to show for it. And so without a male heir, this was considered a serious problem, and so they were able to get an annulment from the Pope. And the way you went about getting an annulment was that you suddenly realized that you were too closely related to each other to have gotten married in the first place. So there were what were called prohibited degrees of consanguinity, which simply meant you married a cousin who was too closely related to you. And so even though Eleanor and Louis knew that they were too closely related, they had gotten a special dispensation to get married in the first place, and then when it was like, well, things aren't working out, like, oh yeah, we just remembered, we shouldn't have gotten married in the first place. Similarly, Eleanor and Henry were also too closely related to have gotten married, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Or wait, I might have to look at that again. But yeah, that's basically what you did. So even though the church was definitely tightening the rules and insisting on the indissolubility of marriage, there were still loopholes that you could exploit, and one of them was consanguinity. You could suddenly realize that you were too closely related to have been married in the first place.
How very convenient.
Yes.
There's a number of questions about commoners. And so I'll read one of them, but a number of folks have asked sort of similar things. So if a common man committed assault, burglary, or violated some rule against another common man, what was the most common type of punishment, if not prison?
Oh, mutilation was a popular one. Mutilation and hanging were the 2 major ones. One of the things that I didn't want to get too deep in the technical vocabulary, but commoner is a little bit misleading because there's definitely a distinction between freemen and peasants, both of which would be considered commoners, but they're slightly different kinds of commoners. So freemen would have had access to royal courts. For a lot of peasants, even in the 12th century, they would have only had very, very limited access. But typically, punishments for theft could be very severe and include things like, having your hand amputated, depending on the time period. So yeah, the punishments tended to be very harsh.
Great. A question about the rapidity with which things changed. Somebody asked, how did the discovery of one book of Roman law in the 6th century, I guess from the 6th century, have such a transformative effect on the German law and common law in the Middle Ages? How was a single discovery able to, quote unquote, sweep the land?
That is an excellent question, and I will say that it's not just the recovery of Roman law that is having this effect, but what it does is it gives A lot of the people who are building the 12th century is a time of institution building. It's when Western Europe finally starts getting, like we see the development of the exchequer in England under Henry I, the first sort of permanent government institution. So there had been sort of a start at this at Anglo-Saxon England, but there were Viking invasions that sort of interrupted that. Essentially, the 12th century is just this really, you have a lot of things coming together. You've got the rediscovery of Roman law, you've got the rise of the universities, so people studying this law who are being, they are going on to staff the bureaucracies that are being built by both kings and the papacy at this point in time. And so you really, like the 12th century, in fact, we have a term for it, it's the 12th century Renaissance. So it's this incredibly dynamic time. The recovery of Roman law is really one aspect of it. It's a very important aspect, but it's not the only thing. I certainly don't want to give the impression that it's the only thing fueling this. It's just sort of, it comes in at the right time.
Great.
Yeah.
We'll do one more. So this series of lectures is a series of vignettes, right? Looking back, looking forward, all of which offer rather fundamentally different carceral regimes. And there's a question about what comes next. Specifically, and this may be, again, slightly, not to worry you, slightly pushing forward, but the question is, how did the Magna Carta and the origin of civil and political rights to include a due process influence imprisonment in England?
Oh, wow. Okay, that's also a really...
Just a quick one to end with.
I know. Oh my gosh, books have been written about this. So obviously, Magna Carta is incredibly important for establishing the principle that a person cannot be deceased or, exiled without a judgment of their peers. This generally applies to the nobility at first, but certainly the expectation that due process, I think this is, one of the interesting things about Magna Carta is that what Magna Carta attempts to do really is hold the king to standards that the nobles already expected. And the reason is because John was violating all of these expectations on a regular basis. And so this is not a new expectation that is coming up. What it is the barons trying to extract a promise from the king that he is going to observe an existing norm. So I would actually argue that this expectation of due process was already really well enshrined and ingrained. It was just the barons taking this opportunity to, when they basically had John backed against a wall, to have him sign something saying he'd promised to do it.
Please join me in thanking Professor Urbanski.
Thank you.